So thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. I think for me, the perhaps the thing that I'm focused on, or the thing that I feel qualified to talk about, is media narratives, which is just such a huge issue in terms of how we can change anything. Um, and I mean, I think quite obviously there are two really big issues that just constantly play out in the media. And one is, um, which we've actually already mentioned a little bit, is this notion that war somehow works or is effective, or that it's going to bring the solution to some situation. And we hear this all the time, this sort of, violence is the only thing Putin understands. And as though this is the only way that we can ever end any conflict, whereas in fact we know that conflicts actually end with conversations and negotiations and people sitting around a table sooner or later, and therefore the sooner we do it, the better. And also this notion that war is effective in somehow making people's lives better, um, where in actual fact it would be much better for people to live without a war, in a country that doesn't have exactly the boundaries that they would prefer. It would be much better for people to live without a war in a situation of ongoing negotiation than to live under a war in the dream that eventually they'll end up with, some political aims that are probably really only useful to their leaders and not to them. The second thing that I think the media does very dangerously is its extreme insistence on partisanship. Is this question of, if you criticize what Israel is doing, then the response is that you must like Hamas, and vice versa. And you get that across conflicts. If you criticize what's being done in Ukraine, then you must support Putin. And if you criticize anything like this, it always bounces back to, there are two official points of view, and this kind of Overton window around what is the acceptable view on it. I also think that there's a third level in which the media is complicit in propagating war, and I think that is the priority window. So when we have these topical and political shows, which is absolutely my bread and butter, to go on and have these debates, and they say, we can't wait to have you on. We thought about what we thought we'd talk about whether it's okay when women get whistled at the bus stop, and I do have an opinion on that. But it's frightening when that seems to get discussed every week, and I'm kind of going, genocide? Could we talk about that? I mean, and also the other things that are huge, and climate change, and these enormous topics that we should be focused on. And yet the media so often is focused on whether people are misusing the bicycling lane, or these kind of other potholes in your area. And not that anyone should be prohibited from debating these issues that matter to them in lots of cases, but the way that the media can present the main news and somehow not really talk about big things that are going on, and huge scale protests not getting a mention. Huge issues that are affecting millions of people somehow being glossed over or left for sort of a 6 months later documentary. So there's a lot there. And I don't think that there's a magical one trick solution, but I do think that there are a few things that can be reasonably done. In terms of the Overton window, in terms of the priorities window, I'll start there, which is slightly in reverse order of what I said. But in fact, I think the point would apply to all of them, is that we have to keep kicking back against these narratives whenever we get the chance, whether it's from being on air and being able to speak about them, but also being able to respond to these shows, even being able to call in and say, first of all, this idea that you can only support one side or the other is completely false. And in actual fact, the vast majority of people on both sides of every conflict benefit more than anything from not being in a conflict situation. I've talked a lot myself about the impact of what's happening in Gaza on Israeli conscripts, because they are, being sent into an area where they're expected to commit war crimes, and they're now talking about conscripting 16-year-olds, and that cannot be what is the best way forward for Israeli youth. So the idea that I think that's a really important thing to be challenging. Obviously, the idea that war is effective and leads to solutions is something that we can challenge, but I also think we can challenge this priority window. And I try to do it as often as I can, and kind just accept that they're going to have me on to talk about whistling at bus stops. Um, but then somehow weave it in and somehow say there's also more important things going on, and let's look at the bigger picture, and then people might also be affected by other stuff, and kind of planning it out. And I have a bit of a sort of reputation for doing that on air, to the point where then I think it backfires and people don't invite me back because they think I'm going to do that thing. But I still think we need to keep going with it. And I do think that we are always fighting a slightly losing battle, because the media companies have a preset agenda. And when people don't play the role they've been assigned within that agenda, very often, they'll ring me up and they'll say, what do you think about this situation? And when I don't say, A, I love Zelensky, or B, I love Putin, then they're like, oh, no, that's not what we're looking for. And so we have to constantly try and have those conversations and say, there's other angles that need to be represented. And in fact, angles that represent the vast majority of people. The other thing that we can do, apart from challenging the media narratives that are being put out by the mainstream media, is to contribute to and be a part of the alternative media. And I know lots of you will be aware of my Music Hate series, which has been running for 16 years now, where I talk about often issues that haven't been covered in the mainstream, or angles that haven't been covered. And I know I've talked about PPU and some of the work that we're doing on lots of occasions. And even then, we're fighting an uphill battle, because the mainstream media also controls things like the algorithm, and which videos get viewed, and which things get commented on, and which things get shared, and which things sometimes get cancelled and blocked and taken down from social media. And there is absolutely an agenda going on there. But the situation is not, I say the situation is not beyond hope. Let me vaguely qualify that, because I do think, especially with what's been going on in recent days, that it's difficult to be a peace campaigner at the moment. One thing I've heard kicked back when I raise these kind of issues is, well, your side is losing, this message isn't getting through, things are getting worse, not better, etc., etc. And I'm always forced to remind people that I don't fight on this side of the debate or stand up for this side of the argument because I think we're winning. I do it because I think it's right. And I win or lose, the whole point is to be there on the side of truth and justice. That's the only thing that I can live with personally for myself. There are lots and lots of things we can do. And the main one, I think, is to be unfatigued in tracking down the positive messages, in responding to the negative ones and pointing out the hypocrisy of them, and in pushing these messages over and over again, especially when we see the sort of same old talking points come up, and there's an opportunity to push back against it. And even if it's just sort of sharing things that you see, or putting them out there, but also contributing to the discussion and educating ourselves on the ways to respond to that. I think there is some hope, and I think there are really constructive things that we can do. I love it when I come back to my social media account and some people have said obnoxious, very sort of militaristic things. The whole thing is trouble. And before I have a chance to respond, I see other people already have. And the message of peace and whatever is already being spread before I come back to respond to it myself. And people have said nasty and unpleasant, very aggressive things. But before I get to take them personally, somebody else has already responded going, don't be ridiculous. This is a peaceful channel that's trying to promote something really important. Or even simple things where someone has said, why are you writing about what Israel are doing? Where have you written about what Saudi Arabia are doing? And then somebody underneath will have written, oh, here's a link to Kate's video on Saudi Arabia. And it's just that thing of me not having to do every bit of the argument myself. And I think we can be there a lot for one another when you see other people raising their voices. And sometimes they might be raising their voices for the first time, and the support of the rest of us can be really powerful. And other times you might see someone literally on question time, but there is going to be a reaction to that on the internet. There's going to be a reaction to that in terms of people writing to the BBC and all that kind of stuff. And we can be one of those voices that says, we want more of this. We want to hear more of these peaceful voices. We want to support this. We think this is important. And we want to counteract the way that things are being pushed in the other direction. We are, regardless of how things might be moving, the majority, I believe. Certainly in terms of the people who benefit from ending conflict, we are very much the majority, the vast, overwhelming majority. in that we don't own any arms factories. Yeah, and yes, that's what I wanted to say. And thank you. And I'll be happy to join in some discussion in a little bit.